Chapter 7. Denial. Viktor Brukhanov was asleep in his elite apartment building on the corner of Lenin and Kurchatov avenues in Pripyat when the telephone rang around 2 a.m. on April the 26th. "Viktor Petrovich, something has happened at the station. Do you know what?" came the distressed voice of the chief of the plant's chemical unit, who had decided to call the director at home in violation of every written and unwritten rule of conduct. Brukhanov knew nothing. The chief chemist told him that there had been an explosion, but he knew little more. After hanging up the receiver, Brukhanov tried to call the power plant, but there was no answer. He dressed and rushed downstairs. On the street, he boarded the company bus to the plant. What could have happened? All he could surmise was that something had happened to one of the steam pipelines. That was the kind of accident everyone knew could happen, though they hoped it would not. As the bus entered the grounds of the plant, he realized it could not just be the pipeline. The top of Unit 4 was gone. His heart sank. "This is my prison," he said to himself. Brukhanov realized immediately that life, as he knew it, a successful career, participation in the party congress, government awards, was over. He would have to bear responsibility for the disaster, whether he was guilty or not. In the 1930s, thousands of managers had been accused of sabotage, or worse, of being foreign spies, and sentenced to long terms in the Gulag or even shot for accidents at their plants. Although such accusations were no longer in vogue, in the Soviet system a director was invariably blamed for a disaster that took place on his watch. Normally a man of few words, Brukhanov would become even less talkative. Those who saw him that night had no doubt that he was not only under stress, but also depressed by what had happened. His face was rigid, his reactions slow, his whole appearance that of a man who had lost his way. The situation was obviously bad, but Brukhanov wanted to know how bad and what had caused it. From the director's office in the administration building, he dialed the number of the chief of the night shift, Boris Rogoshkin. But Rogoshkin's telephone was silent. Brukhanov then ordered all his top managers to be summoned to the plant. On Rogoshkin's orders, the telephone operator was already calling the managers one by one. Brukhanov asked why the automatic alarm system that used pre-recorded tape to make telephone calls to the senior management was not activated. He was told that the operator was not sure how serious the accident was and which tape to use. Brukhanov ordered that the comprehensive accident tape be used, indicating the highest level of alert. It meant that the accident could have an impact beyond the premises of the plant. Although Brukhanov still did not know what had happened, what he had seen was alarming enough. With no one available to advise him about what had actually happened at the plant, the distressed Brukhanov decided to investigate for himself and ran in the direction of Unit 4. As he approached it, he stumbled over pieces of graphite on the ground, but dismissed the possibility that they might have come from within the reactor. He clipped one of them with his shoe and kept going. The building next to the reactor hall that housed the emergency cooling system was in ruins, destroyed by the explosion. That was bad enough. He did not want to see the rest. Brukhanov retraced his steps and returned to his office. The first managers, summoned in the middle of the night by the telephone operator, finally started to arrive. Brukhanov ordered that the entrance to the underground bunker, a nuclear shelter designed as a command post in case of a nuclear war or emergency, be opened. He told the managers to find out what was going on in their respective units and report to him. Everyone hit the phones. The director took the most thankless task of all upon himself, to call the ministry officials and party bosses in Moscow and Kiev to inform them of the accident. He told them what he had seen. The explosion had destroyed a good part of Unit 4, and he was studying the situation. They responded that they were sending their people to the plant and ordered him to figure out what had happened as soon as possible. Brukhanov finally got Rogoshkin on the phone. The chief of the night shift had just returned to his office after visiting the turbine hall. He had also been to the control room of Unit 4, where he had discussed the situation with the chief of the unit's shift, Alexander Akimov, as well as the operator of the reactor, Leonid Tuptunov, and the man in charge of the turbine test, Deputy Chief Engineer Anatoly Diatlov. They were shocked, depressed, and unable to understand what had happened. "Borya," said Diatlov to Rogozhkin, addressing him by the diminutive of his first name, Boris. "We pressed the AZ5 button, emergency shutdown, and 12 to 15 seconds later the unit exploded." Rogozhkin had seen people burned by steam and helped evacuate one of them, Volodymyr Shashinok. They were looking for missing people. A few were still unaccounted for. That was all Rogozhkin could tell Brukhanov. He offered to put him in touch with Diatlov, but Brukhanov responded that he would call Diatlov himself. Like everyone else, Anatoly Diatlov was at a loss to understand what had happened. When the emergency electrical generators started up and the lights came on again in the control room after the second blast, his first guess was that the emergency protection and control system tank, which contained about 110,000 litres of hot water and steam and was located at level plus 71 metres or 233 feet above the ground, directly over the control room, had exploded. If that was indeed the case, the control room would be flooded with hot water in no time. He ordered everyone to relocate to the emergency control room. But the operators were too distressed and preoccupied with trying to understand their indicators, which were flashing all over the control panel, with needles swinging erratically on instrument scales, to pay any attention to the order. Since no water was seeping through the ceiling, Diatlov did not insist. But if the emergency water tank had not exploded, what was going on? Diatlov rushed to the control panel and began to examine the scales and indicators. By now they were either dead or putting out information that was hard to comprehend. The indicators showing water flow to the active zone of the reactor were on 0. That was terrible news. Diatlov believed that the reaction had already been shut down, but he also knew that with the reactor still overheated, the fuel rods, deprived of coolant, would disintegrate in no time. In a loud voice he gave the order, "Cool the reactor at emergency speed." The emergency water pumps that had been shut off in preparation for the test now had to be restarted, and the laborious task of opening the gate valves had to be done in record time. Diatlov was afraid that he did not have enough time to cool the rods, but he saw no other way of saving the reactor. He ordered Akimov to get in touch with the electricians as soon as possible and restart the pumps. Then, as if the water situation were not bad enough, Diatlov found that something had gone terribly wrong with the control rods. The indicators showed that the rods, which were supposed to stop the reaction, had stopped after descending only 1/3 of their way into the active zone of the reactor. The fission reaction was still going on, and as far as Diatlov could tell, there was no water there to cool the fuel rods. Akimov cut off the power supply to the servo drives that moved the jammed rods in the hope that they would continue the descent on their own. They did not. Diatlov ordered Viktor Proskoryakov and Alexander Kudryavtsev, the 2 interns who had been present in the control room during the test, to run to the reactor hall and try to use mechanical gears to insert the control rods by hand more deeply into the reactor's active zone. They left before he realized the absurdity of his command. If the rods had not gone down with the electricity cut off from the servo drives, then they could not be pushed down by hand either. He ran into the corridor to stop the interns, but they were gone. The corridor was full of smoke and dust. Diatlov returned to the control room and ordered the ventilation to be turned on. Diatlov's next destination was the turbine hall, located on the other side of the control room. The hall was on fire. That terrifying news had been brought to the control room by one of the mechanics, soon after Diatlov ordered the reactor to be cooled at emergency speed. The first to hasten there was Razim Davletbayev, the deputy head of the turbine unit. What he saw was more than shocking. The roof over one of the turbines was breached and caved in. Some of the girders were hanging down, remembered Davletbayev. I saw one of them fall into the low-pressure cylinder of turbo generator 7. From somewhere above I could hear the sound of escaping steam, although neither steam nor smoke nor fire was visible in the broken spaces of the roof. What could be seen instead were the stars shining brightly in the night sky. Diatlov was horrified by what he saw. A picture worthy of the pen of the great Dante, he recalled later. Streams of hot water were bursting in every direction from the damaged pipes and falling on the electrical equipment. There was steam everywhere, and the crackling sounds of short circuits in the electrical system resounded as sharply as gunshots. Near Turbine 7, Diatlov saw turbine engineers with fire extinguishers and water hoses trying to douse burning machine oil. The oil feed pump had been broken by falling equipment, and 200 tons of machine oil were making their way onto the floor, threatening to turn the turbine hall into a burning hell that could consume not only Unit 4 but the whole plant, as all the units shared the same turbine hall. Davletbaev and his men began redirecting machine oil from the feed pipes and turbines into the underground reservoir. They also started to remove hydrogen from the turbines located next to the damaged turbine generator to avoid a new explosion. Outside the control room, Diatlov ran into the first victims of the explosion, engineers burned by steam from the damaged pipes. He told them to go to the medical station. After he returned to the control room, Volodymyr Shashenok, an engineer, was brought in from the startup unit. During the test, he had been monitoring the indicators on level +24 of the unit when the explosion burst the hot water and steam pipes, causing severe burns to his entire body. Volodya sat in a chair, just weakly moving his eyes, neither groaning nor crying out. Evidently the pain had exceeded any conceivable level and rendered him unconscious, recalled Diatlov. Rogozhkin, who visited the control room, helped to take Shashenok to the medical station on a stretcher. Several engineers who had been in the unit at the time of the explosion could not be located. Meanwhile, Akimov was struggling to supply water to what he believed was a rapidly overheating reactor. The internal telephone system was dead, as cables had been severed by the explosion, but miraculously the city telephones were working. Akimov called the electricians, asking them to restore power to the pumps so that he could cool the reactor. They promised to do what they could. Akimov asked Yuri Trehub, the chief of the evening crew, who was still around, to go and try to open the gate valves of the cooling system manually. Trehub and another operator from his shift, Sergei Gazin, ran up the stairs to level +27. As they arrived, they noticed that they had difficulties swallowing because their throats and tongues were swollen. But that seemed to be the least of their problems. When Trehub opened the door to the hall where the mechanical controls for the valves were located, he was hit with a blast of hot steam. He had to give up any hope of getting inside. It was impossible to breathe there. Trehub and Gazin had to return to the control room, their task unfulfilled. Not knowing that the reactor had already exploded, Akimov was terrified of what could happen to it because of overheating. More bad news came when Proskuryakov and Kudryavtsev, the two interns sent by Diatlov to try to push the control rods into the reactor by hand, returned to the control room. They had tried taking the elevator to reach the reactor hall, located on level +36, 36 meters above the ground, but it was jammed, and they had to use the stairs. It was a difficult ascent through stairwells full of debris. It was wet and dangerously hot as well, with water and steam bursting out of the damaged pipes. Eventually they had to turn back as access to the reactor hall was blocked by collapsed walls and parts of the concrete ceiling. They did not reach their objective, but had gotten close enough to the damaged reactor for that trip to cost them their lives. They told Diatlov and Akimov that their mission had failed. Those in the control room concluded that the reaction was still going on with no water to cool the reactor. They tried not to think about the possible consequences. Proskuryakov told Trehub that he thought the active zone of the reactor had melted down. What he had in mind was the melting of the core of the reactor caused by the overheating and the possible escape of uranium fuel from the containment. Trehub agreed. He had seen a glow when he stepped out of the unit a few minutes earlier and assumed that once the overheated reactor had melted down, the abrupt rise in temperature had caused Elena, the 200-ton concrete plate covering the reactor, to heat up and illuminate the surroundings. He could not imagine that the plate had actually been blown into the air by the first explosion. "Why is nothing being done?" asked the distressed Proskuriakov. Trehub went to see Diatlov and shared his concerns. "Let's go," responded Diatlov. They went outside. Trehub remembered telling his boss, "This is Hiroshima." Diatlov remained silent at first, but then told Trehub, "I've never dreamed anything like this, even in a nightmare." That night Diatlov walked twice around the ruins, first around 1:40 a.m., and then soon after 2 a.m. He could still not comprehend what had happened. His theory about an explosion in the emergency water tank had by now been discarded for another. For some reason, the water pumps had burst in the active zone of the reactor, causing it to explode and raise Elena into the air. The explosion allowed steam and radioactivity to be released before the concrete plate fell back into place and sealed off the reactor. Diatlov returned to the control room and began thinking about how to prevent the disaster from spreading beyond the confines of Unit 4. He told Akimov to switch off electrical cables wherever possible to avoid short circuits and the spread of the fire to Unit 3. Davletbaev and his men were releasing machine oil from the pipes and the turbine generator, and Diatlov told Major Telyatnikov, who showed up in the control room, that with the fire on the roof of the turbine hall extinguished, the priority was the roof of Unit 3. He walked to the control room of Unit 3 and ordered the shutdown of its reactor, while that was still possible. What else could be done? Diatlov realized that there was no need for all those people to be in and around the control room. He knew that the radiation levels had risen and were high. Those in charge had tried to measure the levels immediately after the blast, but did not get very far. The dosimeter they had measured radiation in micro-rontgens per second. The name Rontgen, a unit of measurement of exposure to gamma rays and X-rays, comes from the discoverer of X-rays, Wilhelm Röntgen. Rontgens, millirontgens, 0.001 of a Rontgen, and micro-rontgens, 0.001 of a millirontgen, did not measure all ionizing radiation, which also included alpha and beta particles as well as neutrons, but they gave a good idea of overall radiation levels. The maximum value of the dosimeter available to Diatlov and his crew was 1,000 micro-rontgens per second, or 3.6 rontgens per hour. The dosimeter showed that in one part of the control room the radiation level had reached 800 micro-rontgens per second, while in another part the reading was off the scale. They assumed that the radiation level might be around 5 rontgens per hour. The emergency maximum for operators was 25 rontgens. Diatlov and others thought they were good for a few hours. It was an emergency, after all. But if the situation in the control room was tolerable, radiation levels outside must have been extreme. People around Diatlov who had ventured outside the control room for a longer period were already feeling dizzy. Their skin was getting darker and their headaches were worsening, all signs of radiation sickness. It was best to get them away from the source of radioactivity as soon as possible. Diatlov ordered everyone who was not a member of the shift crew to leave. Such people included the interns, Kudryavtsev and Proskuriakov. He also saw no reason for Leonid Toptunov and Igor Kirschenbaum, the two operators from Akimov's shift, to stay, so he ordered them to go to Unit 3. To prevent radiation from penetrating that unit, he ordered the ventilation system in Unit 4 to be shut down and ventilation in Unit 3 to be switched into high gear. It seemed like a good idea at the time, but in fact Diatlov's order increased the intake of radioactive air from outside, and the outside air was far more contaminated than the air inside Unit 4. The crew members missing immediately after the explosion had by now been located, with the exception of Valery Khodemchuk, the circulating pump operator, who was on shift that night. The part of the engine room where he had been working, at level +10, had collapsed. Diatlov and 2 other engineers decided to try searching once again. They reached the entrance to the engine room but could not move much farther. The concrete ceiling had collapsed and the door to the operator's office had been smashed by a falling crane. Water was pouring in from broken pipes on one of the floors above. Valery Perevozchenko, the chief of the turbine shift, who accompanied Diatlov, climbed up to the office door but could not open it. He shouted through the door but received no response. Soaked by the falling water, he had to turn back. The radioactive shower would cost him his life. It was then that Diatlov began to feel exhausted. He was nauseous and could barely stand on his feet. Doctors would later estimate his dose of ionizing radiation at 13 times above the emergency norm. At his level of biological damage, most people did not survive for more than 60 days. Diatlov had given up fighting for the reactor. As he subsequently wrote in his memoirs, he knew the reactor was dead, but he lacked the strength to say so aloud. He assumed that there was no need for words. As an experienced engineer, Akimov surely understood the consequences of interrupting the flow of water to the reactor. In fact, Akimov refused to admit that the reactor was damaged and kept pumping water. Some witnesses claimed to have heard Diatlov giving instructions to do that very thing. Diatlov was probably of 2 minds himself, as he understood that there was no point in continuing to pump water, but had nothing better to suggest. At least supplying water meant keeping some kind of hope alive. Around the time he decided he had done everything he could, Diatlov received a call from Viktor Brukhanov, who wanted him in the underground bunker. Around 4 a.m., Diatlov finally left Unit 4. Akimov remained behind. His shift was not over yet. "What happened?" was the first question Brukhanov asked his deputy chief engineer when Diatlov arrived. Diatlov spread his hands as an indication that he did not know. He said to the head of the plant's Communist Party committee, Sergei Parashin, who was sitting next to the director, "I don't understand it at all." The power level had been rising rapidly before the explosion, he said, and something had happened to make the control rods stick in the intermediate position. Diatlov gave the director the automatically recorded data on the equipment in Unit 4. Brukhanov took the records but did not seem interested in continuing the conversation. Diatlov was clearly in bad shape, pale and nauseous, almost at the point of vomiting. After talking to Brukhanov and Parashin, he rushed out of the bunker, where an ambulance picked him up. Meanwhile, everyone in the bunker was working toward one goal: to supply water to reactor number 4. Diatlov knew that it had exploded, but did not say that to his bosses. There were about 30 or 40 people in the bunker. There was constant noise as everyone spoke with his unit by telephone, recalled Parashin, a bespectacled 39-year-old nuclear engineer turned party organizer. With Brukhanov busy responding to endless calls from Moscow and Kiev, Parashin took upon himself the role of crisis manager, talking to those coming into the bunker, suggesting solutions, and giving recommendations to the director, which Brukhanov was generally happy to accept. A few hours before Diatlov reached the bunker, Brukhanov, still in the dark about what happened at Unit 4, had sent another deputy chief engineer, Anatoly Sitnikov, and the chief of Unit 1, Vladimir Chugunov, to reconnoiter. They had previously worked at Unit 4 and knew it better than anyone else. "They have to be sent. No one can understand the situation and help Diatlov better than they can," suggested Parashin. Brukhanov agreed. The duo's main tasks were to assess the situation and make sure the reactor's emergency cooling system was on. They examined the half-destroyed unit. The explosion had blown away a good part of it, and radiation levels were high, but they did not know how high. Dosimeters with 1,000 micro-rontgens per second scales were of no use. Sitnikov could see graphite blocks and fragments of red-hot fuel rods lying around. He climbed up to the roof of the reactor hall and looked into the exploded reactor. It was a glance that would cost him his health and his life. "I think it's been destroyed," Sitnikov told one of his fellow engineers a few hours later. "It's blazing away. Hard to believe, but it's true." Still, Sitnikov and Chugunov kept doing what they were told. They tried to open the gate valves on the water feed lines to supply water to the reactor. Sitnikov knew that it had been destroyed but refused to admit it. The task was impossible. The gate valves were closed too tightly. The two managers, exhausted and already dizzy from radioactive poisoning, needed help. Chugunov went back to get assistance. When he returned to Unit 4, around 7 a.m., with 3 young engineers, he found Sitnikov, his head down on a desk, suffering from nausea. Next to him were Alexander Akimov and Leonid Toptunov, the chief of the night shift and his reactor operator, who ignored Diatlov's order to leave the unit. They were also in bad shape. Arkady Uskov, one of the engineers who had come to help with the valves, remembered Toptunov as confused and dispirited. He stood silently. Uskov and another engineer managed to open one of the valves, and could hear water rushing through the pipes. Akimov, Toptunov, and one of the new arrivals were supposed to work on another valve. When the Uskov team completed their task and went to check on Akimov and his crew, they found both him and Toptunov vomiting. Viktor Smagin, another new arrival to Unit 4, bumped into Akimov and Toptunov as they were returning to the control room. He remembered them looking extremely depressed, with swollen dark brown faces and hands. Their lips and tongues were so swollen that they could hardly talk. The two had clear signs of radioactive poisoning, but that was not what bothered them most. Smagin found them confused, bewildered, and full of guilt. "I'll never understand it," said Akimov to Smagin, another shift leader who was scheduled to replace him that morning in the control room of Unit 4. "We did everything right. Why did it happen?" He then continued, addressing Smagin by his diminutive. "It really hurts, Vitya. We really screwed up." When Uskov and his crew finished opening the second valve and returned to the control room, Akimov and Toptunov immediately went to the restroom, where they continued to vomit. "How are you?" Uskov asked Toptunov when he returned to the control room. "Fine, I'm already feeling better," responded Toptunov. "I can work some more." One of the newcomers helped Akimov and Toptunov walk to Unit 3. Akimov had a copy of the turbine test program in his hands. He must have felt that it was his only hope of proving that what had happened at Unit 4 that night was not his fault. Akimov told one of his friends that he had just followed the program and asked him to give the document to his wife and no one else. He no longer seemed to trust anyone. Now that his shift was finally over, an ambulance took him to the Pripyat hospital. He would die on May the 11th, the same day as Lieutenant Pravik. Toptunov would pass away 3 days later. Smagin, Uskov, and their crew stayed in Unit 4 helping to open new valves. Water was pouring into the reactor zone, but no one knew exactly where. The water became radioactive and flooded the underground compartments of the reactor, which were crammed with switching gears and cables. When the engineers working the next shift looked out the window, they could not believe their eyes. The reactor hall of Unit 4 was in ruins, and among the debris were pieces of the square block of graphite from the active zone of the reactor. "What we saw was so terrifying that we were afraid to say it aloud," recalled Uskov. When they told the shift's deputy chief engineer, Mikhail Lyutov, about the graphite upon his arrival, he dismissed their fears. Lyutov's full title was Deputy Chief Engineer for Scientific Affairs, and he declared that if anyone could tell him the temperature of the graphite inside the reactor, he would describe the state of the reactor precisely. They responded that the graphite was not inside but outside the reactor. Lyutov did not believe them. "Although he was my supervisor, I began to scream at him, asking what he thought it could be if not graphite," remembered Smagin. Lyutov finally had to agree that it was graphite. It was no longer possible to deny that graphite was out there, but where had it come from? They checked the graphite that was to be installed in the 5th reactor, still under construction. The piles of that graphite were intact. The only other possible source was the reactor of Unit 4. That would also explain the exceptionally high levels of radiation at the plant. But few dared to challenge the belief that the reactor could not possibly have exploded. The mind refuses to believe that the worst that could happen has happened, wrote Uskov in his diary for that day. Like Smagin, he was upset by Lyutov's refusal to admit the obvious. The stress was too great, and our belief that the reactor could not explode was also too great, said Sergei Parashin, summing up the situation a few months later. Mass blindness. Many see what has happened, but do not believe it. As the sun rose above the ruined Unit 4, the bunker shelter at the Chernobyl power plant began to fill with high officials who had arrived from Kiev. The most senior of them was Volodymyr Malomuzh, the second secretary of Kiev's regional party committee, who had headed the Kiev delegation to the party congress in Moscow a few months earlier. Brukhanov had called him earlier to inform him about the accident. At that time his information had been very general. Now Parashin approached Brukhanov with one of the department heads of the Kiev party committee, suggesting that Malomuzh would need an official statement on the causes of the accident and the situation at the plant. Brukhanov delegated the task to Parashin. When the document, which was put together with the help of quite a few officials, was finally ready, Brukhanov signed it along with the head of the plant's dosimetry unit, Vladimir Korobinikov. The memo provided general information about the accident, mentioning the collapse of the roof of reactor number 4. It also gave the radiation levels: 1,000 micro-rontgens per second at the plant, and 2.4 micro-rontgens in the city. The figures reflected more wishful thinking than reality, especially when it came to the plant. Brukhanov knew that the actual radiation levels were higher, but with the scales of the available dosimeters limited to 1,000 micro-rontgens per second, he decided to list that figure. Korobinikov, who had taken measurements in Pripyat, was at his side. His measurements indicated that the radionuclides, or atoms with unstable nuclei, that were emitting ionizing radiation, displacing electrons in human DNA and disrupting its functioning, had very short half-life periods and were about to dissipate without causing any harm. It turned out that the radioactive cloud caused by the explosion had missed the city for the time being. With Korobinikov insisting that radiation levels were relatively low, Brukhanov felt that he could ignore the alarming data coming from the plant itself. Serafim Vorobev, the head of the plant's civil defense department, first reported the radiation data a few minutes after following Brukhanov's order to open the underground bunker that then served as the emergency headquarters for Brukhanov and his team of managers. Shortly after 2 a.m., Vorobev had switched on his dosimeter, the only one at the plant that had a scale of 200 rontgens, and found that the radiation level in the bunker was 30 millirontgens per hour, 600 times above the norm. The radiation could only have come from outside, so Brukhanov ordered Vorobev to switch on the ventilation filters. Vorobev did so, went outside and switched on his dosimeter once again. The radiation level was 5 times the one he had registered in the bunker. He went around the plant with his dosimeter on. Near Unit 4, the dosimeter went off the scale, indicating that the radiation level exceeded 200 rontgens per hour. When Vorobev returned to the bunker and reported his measurements to Brukhanov, the director did not want to listen. "Go away," he told the only man around with the right dosimeter, pushing him aside with his hand. Vorobev then turned to Parashin. But the party chief was of little help. Like Brukhanov, he was not prepared psychologically to accept any more bad news. "Why didn't I believe him?" asked Parashin in retrospect, trying to explain his reaction to what he had heard. Vorobev is highly emotional by nature, and when he said that, he was frightening to look at. "And I didn't believe him. I told him, go and convince the director." Vorobev went back to Brukhanov. Following the instructions in his manuals, he demanded that Brukhanov declare a state of radioactive emergency. The requirements of the standard documents in such cases were as follows, Vorobev later said. If a radiation level of 0.05 millirontgens per hour was exceeded, the civilians had to be informed and given directions on actions to take under those circumstances. Furthermore, he added, if the level exceeded 200 millirontgens, the siren was to be sounded, indicating radiation danger. He reminded Brukhanov of the protocol, but Brukhanov would not listen. He told Vorobev to inform Civil Defense Headquarters in Kiev, but not to tell anyone else about his findings. The radiation levels that Vorobev detected in and around the bunker were from ionizing radiation. Ionizing radiation is caused by high-energy, high-speed atoms and subatomic particles that are moving quickly enough to free electrons from atoms, or ionize them. Electromagnetic waves can be strong enough to have the same capacity. Gamma rays and X-rays belong to the latter category, while alpha and beta particles, along with neutrons, belong to the former. The ionizing radiation at Chernobyl was activated by the radioactive fission products blasted into the atmosphere by the explosion of the reactor. They included isotopes of iodine and cesium, including iodine-131 and cesium-137, as well as gases such as xenon-133. The radiation levels were extremely high after the blast, and Vorobev's dosimeter went off the scale at 200 rontgens per hour for good reason. It was later estimated that the debris around the damaged reactor emanated radiation at a level of 10,000 rontgens per hour. That radiation was killing human cells or making them malfunction. The more cells are destroyed, the lower the chance of survival. 500 rontgens sustained over a period of 5 hours meant certain death. Even as Brukhanov dismissed Vorobev, he was by no means certain that his civil defense chief was making things up. When Parashin asked Brukhanov about the situation after his conversation with Vorobev, Brukhanov responded with one word: bad. His main concern was about the city of Pripyat rather than the plant. He had first raised the possibility of evacuating civilians sometime in the morning, in conversations with local party and city officials. The head of the city council had scolded him. "Why are you in a panic? A commission will come. They'll come from the oblast and they'll decide." Late in the morning, Brukhanov raised the same question with Volodymyr Malomush upon his arrival. The answer was the same: don't panic. As far as Brukhanov was concerned, he was in no position to argue with such a high-ranking party official. Besides, the statement he had signed earlier that morning conformed to the general tendency to do nothing. When Brukhanov was invited to a meeting of the Pripyat Party Committee, which was convened by Malomush at about 11 a.m., he kept silent. It was mainly Malomush who spoke at the meeting, recalled Brukhanov. Malomush took the line that radiation levels were too low to justify any drastic measures. Later, the city and party officials would blame Brukhanov for not providing them with accurate data. But he remembered, the directive remained the same: don't panic. The government commission will be here soon. It will investigate, and then measures will be taken. Soviet managers and bureaucrats tended to do what years of party rule had trained them to do: avoid responsibility. Everyone was afraid of being accused of spreading panic, and everyone was glad to defer to the higher authorities to make a decision. They were company men, the company being the Soviet system. On April the 26th, starting early in the morning and over the course of the entire day, 132 people, firefighters, operators and engineers, were admitted to the Pripyat hospital with signs of acute radioactive poisoning. As fire trucks sped toward the damaged plant and ambulances brought people to the hospital, the KGB cut intercity telephone lines to prevent information about the accident from spreading beyond the city of Pripyat. The engineers and workers on duty at the plant on the night of April the 26th went home in the morning with strict orders not to say a word about what had happened. with smoke over the destroyed central hall of reactor number 4 clearly visible from balconies of Pripyat apartment buildings, and police patrols controlling access to the plant. The explosion became an open secret to residents of Pripyat. But what exactly was going on? Few thought it amounted to much. That day there were 7 weddings in the city, with people making merry in the shadow of the smouldering Unit 4. G.N. Petrov, a manager at one of the Pripyat firms that installed equipment at the nuclear plant, woke up around 10 a.m. It had been a rough night for him. Driving back to Pripyat at about 2:30 a.m., he had seen Unit 4 on fire. He drove there, stopped the car about 100 yards from the unit, and spent a minute or so observing the damage and the activity of firefighters on the roof. He then felt a sense of alarm and left for home in a panic. There, a neighbour whose husband had been at Unit 4 confirmed what Petrov already knew. There had been an accident. She mentioned radiation and suggested a cure, a bottle of vodka. They drank vodka while making jokes about the whole thing. Now that Petrov was awake, things seemed as normal as could be. "I went onto the balcony for a smoke," he recalled. "There were lots of children in the street. There were kids playing in the sand, building houses, making mud pies. The older ones were racing about on their bikes. Young mothers were out pushing their baby carriages. Everything looked normal." Petrov's next-door neighbour had decided to take it easy that Saturday morning and lay sun-tanning on the roof of the apartment building. At one point, he came down for a drink and said how easy it was to get a tan that day. He had never seen anything like it. He said his skin gave off a smell of burning right away, remembered Petrov, and he was tremendously jolly as if he had just been boozing. He invited Petrov to join him on the roof, saying, "Who needs to go to the beach?" In the evening, an ambulance picked up Petrov's neighbour. He was vomiting, but Petrov made no connection between his neighbour's sudden illness and the accident at the plant. Everything about that day was normal, he recalled. Lyubov Kovalevskaya, the author of the article about problems with the construction of Unit 5 of the Chernobyl plant, which had been published a month earlier but largely ignored, woke up at 11 a.m. She had spent most of the night finishing a poem titled Paganini. Now she was ready to go to a meeting of the Writers' Club she had helped organize in the city. The club was named after Prometheus, the Greek hero who had stolen fire from Mount Olympus and delivered it to mankind. The name seemed perfectly appropriate for the nuclear city of Pripyat, or at least it felt that way at the time. On her way to the meeting, Kovalevskaya noticed something unusual. "I looked and saw a policeman here, a policeman there. I had never seen so many police officers in the city." Becoming alarmed, she returned home and told her mother to keep her daughter and niece inside when they came back from school. Her mother asked what was going on. "I don't know anything, I just feel it," she replied. Her premonition was accurate. The background radiation level of 4 microrontgens recorded by Korobeinikov in Pripyat that morning was 1,000 times higher than the natural background. By 2 p.m. it had increased 10 times to 40 microrontgens per second, and in the evening it rose to 320 microrontgens per second, 80,000 times the natural background. Later that day, experts from Moscow who came to Pripyat to assess the situation measured the biological damage done by the radiation exposure in the units known as REM. 1 REM, or Rontgen equivalent man, is equal to 0.88 of a Rontgen, or 0.01 of a sievert, the unit more commonly used today. They estimated that the radioactive assault on the thyroids of children within 3 kilometers of the reactor amounted to 1,000 REM, and 100 REM in the city of Pripyat. The same experts pointed out that the emergency norm was 30 REM. Children playing on the streets of Pripyat were being exposed to at least 3 times the dose of radiation that was considered unsafe but acceptable for workers in nuclear plants under emergency circumstances. Staff at the Pripyat hospital, which was equipped to deal with almost anything but radioactive poisoning, were busy making room for new patients, who kept arriving with symptoms of acute radiation sickness. They were cleaning the floors in an attempt to keep the radiation levels down in the hospital rooms. Viktor Smagin, the power plant engineer who had helped Alexander Akimov and Leonid Toptunov open the gate valves and had joined them in the hospital by midday, heard a dosimetrist in the corridor demanding that the cleaning ladies do a more thorough job. But there was little they could do. The radiation was coming from the patients themselves. The truth is, nothing like this has ever happened anywhere in the world. We were the first after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, though that was nothing to be proud of, reflected Smagin. Those patients who could still walk gathered in the smoking room of the ward. Among them were Diatlov and Akimov. Everyone wanted to know what had caused the explosion, but neither of them had an explanation.